Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Parenting Through the Pandemic. I'm your host, Craig Nippenberg. We're technically, I've named this phase two that we're still in, but we'll be transitioning out of it soon. Phase two, the Dr. Seuss line of The Waiting Place. This ends week 5 of our livecast programming, Facebook Live, and it's been very exciting. We've had over 5,000 views of the programs. So it's great to have people tuned in and trying to support each other during this time. And especially, as always, we want to think about those who are afflicted with COVID-19. I've learned about a new friend, a child who has it, and it's swept through her family. And of course, those who have lost relatives or loved ones or friends, and continued support for our first responders, our medical responders, and our grocery store people. Also want to special thanks for the past 2 podcasts since I've been on. First of all, Mike and Sydney were on last week talking about working at home, both of them working and having 3 kids. That today is exciting. That's been the most viewed podcast that we've had. So that apparently really tapped a nerve. I also really appreciated they talked about giving each other space and grace as a family. Space and grace. I thought that was just a beautiful line. Also want to thank our school psychologist, Allison, who presented on Tuesday. And a couple points from hers, I thought it was great. She said, you know, right now you have 3 jobs, your working job, your parenting job, and your teaching job. Which is all quite a bit. Loved your concepts of getting your kids involved in passion projects, and we'll talk a little bit about that later this morning when I'm talking about the teen brain, which is our topic for today. Also really loved talking about when she mentioned children with dyslexia, myself being one of them as an adult with dyslexia, and perhaps just letting them read comfort books. Finding old books that they're comfortable with and they're easy to read, and you can just let them enjoy those during this time rather than really pushing the envelope. Also, the importance of executive functioning skills. In my book, Wired and Connected, I talk about the president of your brain, this front part up here. We'll talk about that with the teen brain and what happens to that area. And the president's responsible for those executive skills of planning and following directions. She mentioned cooking and measurements and all that kind of planning out in anticipation of results, maybe some fresh baked cookies or muffins. My daughter's been doing some baking for us. Also loved, I had a great memory. She talked about getting kids involved in gardening, and one that's going to use executive function skills to plan it out. But gardening and working with your hands in the soil is incredibly emotionally attaching for us. It really grounds us emotionally. And the flashback I had was after 9/11, my son was in 2nd grade. And that afternoon of 9/11, I picked him up from school. We headed home and decided to go to my friend's berry patch, the Berry Patch Farms up in northern, just outside of northern Metro Denver. It has a raspberry, you pick at raspberries, strawberries, all kinds of fruits and vegetables. And to this day, I remember just being next to my son, picking berries and talking about 9/11 and the firefighters, and that was incredibly emotionally grounding. So getting out in the yard, doing some yard work, great things for kids. Now, I always like to start the show with some joys or adventures that I collect either in the news or with students I'm seeing here at the office. I thought if you saw this morning's Denver Post, for those of you in Denver, they had just the most delightful cover picture of this couple in their 80s who are secretly hooking up together with appropriate social distancing. Now, when this all started, one of the concerns I had was about how are we going to keep teenagers at home, especially when there's young lovers who are just destined to be with each other, and how do we prevent that? And this couple, she's Danish and he's German. They live right on the border between the 2 countries. And every day at 3 o'clock, they meet at some country road where all they have is a plastic barrier separating the countries. And they set up a table so they have the sitting side by side with a table in the middle for, excuse me, for coffee and schnapps. Just a beautiful story. It's a great interview. And they just talked about they can't hug each other or kiss each other, but they're to get together every day just in love. Just tremendous story. I also had a real kick. I've started doing Zoom classrooms for my as a consultant at St. Anne's Episcopal here in Denver, and I was meeting with some of the fifth graders yesterday, and one of the boys said, "Mr. Nimberg, you got to see my whiteboard." And he held up his laptop, and there was this large whiteboard covering most of his wall. And he had diagrammed the brain from the lessons I taught for fourth graders. I do a whole curriculum on the brain, and it's the basis of my book. But he started with the stuff he said, I started with the stuff you taught me, and I've been studying neuroscience this whole time. And he explained all these different drawings all over his board. It was just fabulous. Got a real kick out of that. Also, a fourth grade student who was using her science brain. And she asked me, she said, well, what do you think the virus does to the brain? And could they figure that out? And if you looked at someone who had died from it and looked at their brain, would there be changes? And I said, I have no idea. But the fact that you're using your science brain right now, which will match a quote I have from Temple Grandin in a second. I was just so pleased with her. Temple Grandin is a very famous author, professor at CSU here in Colorado, who has autism. She's an international lecturer on autism. And she heard a story with her on National Public Radio. And she said, you know, knowledge and seeking knowledge and curiosity is the cure for fear. And that's exactly, without knowing it, that's exactly what this young girl, this fourth grader, was doing. She also recommended a great website. Apparently, you can type in International Space Station. And she said, if you want your kids to learn about living in isolation, just watch how they do it on the International Space Station. Also loved a piece on jigsaw puzzles that have just gone, sales have been through the roof. They can't keep up with the demand in the country. And the single-mindedness of jigsaw puzzles. And a little bit, we'll be talking about dopamine levels in the brain. And when your dopamine levels go up, when you're a little bit hyper-focused on something, your brain goes in a single-mindedness. And it's great for the brain, and it relaxes you. And it talked about that single-mindedness of looking for that one particular piece that you need for that section of the puzzle, and how beneficial that is for the brain. Also thought a great quote, and this fits with what Mike and Sydney were talking about the other day, a story by a Dr. Sheena Gifford in Time magazine. And she's one of the people that lived with 5 others on a simulated Mars base for quite some time. And she said the one thing she learned is, when in doubt, assume the best of others. So next time you're at home and your partner or your children have done something or have created some chaos, we often like to jump to conclusions and assume the worst in others. And her advice is to always assume the best. So again, as we explore and continue today's program on the teen brain, you're more than welcome to type in questions that you have, and Sydney will get those to me. So any questions you have or comments, feel free to type them in on your Facebook page, and she'll forward them to me. Now, the teen brain, and really it's understanding their brains that help you understand their behavior. And one of the reasons why this time is particularly difficult for them being locked down. I want to start with a quote, and I'll see if you can imagine who said it. But the quote, the gentleman said, today's teens are as fickle in their desires as they are vehement in expressing them, which basically means they're constantly changing their minds and seeking desires, and they're really intense. The author of that quote was Aristotle. So the teen brain, we know, has been this way for a long time. And when you look from an evolutionary perspective, the teen brain was really designed to serve some unique functions in our society and to help us survive as a group of people living together in small villages. So basically, three brain areas we'll look at. The first is that area called the president. And to understand that's functioning, I want to teach you about the neurochemical called dopamine. Dopamine is produced in the midbrain, and it runs up through this little area of the brain, which is our connection with pleasure and novelty. So it's our brain's area to feel pleasure and to seek new things. And then it winds up into the president, where it's responsible for the executive functions like paying attention, organization, time management, all of those important areas, something called working memory. And it also, there's another particular area of it, the frontal lobe, the president, for impulse control, where they can control their impulses. Now, when puberty starts, the teens' dopamine levels drop in about half. So they have a natural drop in their dopamine levels. And what that results in is that pleasure area is just very understimulated. So teenagers are prone to feeling bored. They go from excitement and enthusiasm to complete boredom. It also means that they don't get much of a feeling of what's called hedonic pleasure. Hedonic pleasure is when you or I do a job. We do something on our checklist, and it not really an exciting job. Maybe it's, for me, it was doing the first quarter tax report for my state taxes on my book. And not something that I was trained to do or really like to do, but getting it done, I felt this pleasure that I could cross that off my list. And for teens, they just don't have that feeling. Things don't really get them going in the pleasure area unless it has more punch to it, a little bit more zing. Further up in the president, the lower dopamine levels mean they have a hard time paying attention. So particularly your middle schoolers, they're often very spacey, disorganized, discombobulated. I know with online school, so if you think about the online schooling, part of it is the actual work, but a big chunk of that is using your executive functioning skills to figure out what you're supposed to do each day, what your schedule is each day, when you have classes, when you don't, what the assignments are, and how to post your assignments. I can't tell you how many kids I've seen who have posted their assignments to the wrong portal. And not that I know what a portal is, but they posted them somewhere that they weren't supposed to, and they lost the assignments, and the teacher said they hadn't turned anything in, and they had thought they'd finished it and had to redo it. So that area of the brain really is compromised. That will continue. You do see jumps for females, usually around the end of 8th grade. You see some of that frontal lobe functioning come back online. For males, it's not, you see that first phase ends usually about this time of the year, sophomore year in high school. So the brain development for boys is about 2 years behind girls. And that's a function of testosterone during fetal development. So for boys, they'll start to hit a jump there. And then again, you see more progress in college. But ultimately, the frontal lobe isn't fully developed and functioning until females are about 26 and males are about 28. And the impulse control center being in the president means that they can be quite impulsive and really don't think out the consequences of their behavior. So you're seeing all sorts of stuff that teens do all the time where you're just like, how could you think of doing that? And they're like, I wasn't thinking. And you ask them, why'd you do it? And they say, I don't know. And you want to go, of course you know, but actually they don't. They were just impulsive and didn't think it through. Now, the second area, and these two areas of the brain really they work hand in hand, is the emotional center. In my book, I call it the factory. And your emotions, if you think about your brain stem, they're wrapped around your brain stem and sort of like a donut, the shape of a donut. And that's where all our various emotions are, including the amygdala, which is responsible for anxiety, or anger. And as hormones kick in, the emotional area for teenagers, or the emotional functioning of their factory, doubles. So teenagers have twice the emotion of elementary students or adults. It really becomes quite intense. So if you're a parent of a teenager, you'll appreciate this because you've probably had your teen say to you once, "You don't understand how I feel." And guess what? You don't, because your brain doesn't do that anymore. What your hope is that you can remember back to when you were a teenager and how you felt as a teenager and how intense you were. And that's how you can relate to them, is thinking about your own past. But you will not have that feeling now because your emotional system has dampened quite a bit since then. Again, they also can be very defensive and angry. Uh, More than 1,000 parents have said to me, when we have discussions, I try to stay calm. And my teenager says, "Why are you yelling at me? Stop yelling at me." And the parents like, I'm not, honey. I'm talking softly. This is how I always talk. But they really interpret things in a much more hostile way. In fact, if you show pictures of people's emotions, faces, to children, teens, and adults, we're all pretty good at estimating sort of what that person feels. The unique one that really threw the research was a picture of a woman with a neutral face, meaning she wasn't expressing any emotions. She just had a neutral face. And when you ask kids or adults, what's that woman feel? They say nothing. She's not feeling anything. When you ask the teenager what they feel, they say she's angry. She's angry about something. And that's sort of their perception. Now, I mentioned those two areas of the brain work in concert with each other. So when emotions rise up in the brain from the factory, it's your president that's supposed to send out messages to say, "Hey, let's slow down. Just slow down. Let's think about this." And when your brain does that, it actually kicks it to another area in the brain, which I call the blender. It's actually the orbital frontal cortex. And the blender is where you can think about your feelings and you can think, do I really need to be that upset? Maybe I'm overinterpreting this. Maybe that person's intentions weren't hostile. Maybe they weren't on purpose. Let's give the person space and grace. Well, the teen brain really struggles with that. And the closest brain correlation to that is the brain of a preschooler, because preschoolers have lots of emotions. If you think about a basketball team coming down the court with a ball on a fast break, and the preschooler has lots of emotions. They have 4 players coming down the court, just ripping down the court with the ball. And they have one little defender back. His name's Bob, and he's just standing there, and he's probably looking at the popcorn vendor, and the team scores immediately. So anytime you're at the store and the preschooler doesn't get the cookie from the bakery, they just fall apart with emotions. They have very little defense. It pretty much, that analogy holds up for the teen brain. So now their defense that they had as elementary students, where they could stop themselves and they remember that you get what you get, you don't pitch a fit. They can stop their emotions, and their emotions are a little bit less. They dampen during elementary years. Now you're back to, with the teen brain, you're back to lots of emotions and little defense. There's actually an old Hungarian proverb that says, your child at 3 or 4, excuse me, is how they'll be at 13 and 14. And that analogy hits it right on the head. So you've got lots of emotions and little self-control, a lot of boredom, and little sense of pleasure out of the mundane. They are driven for intense emotions and novelty and adventures. Now, the third area of the brain I like to call the mirror. It's responsible for what's called nonverbal processing. It's our ability to notice things in others, to think about what other people feel, to look at them and think about what they're thinking, to think about things like social dynamics and politics and how to influence others, or used in a negative way, how to manipulate others. For humor, it's that explosion in sarcasm. So once you have a middle schooler, you learn really quick that there's certain words that you can't say without them thinking about some sort of sarcastic sex joke. That area of the brain explodes in growth. And as that continues, you really start to see the difference between a male brain and a female brain, where the female brain is doing a lot more of that social processing. And that area gets really intense and is driven by estrogen. So females tend to do quite a bit more of that social piece. But that thing really explodes. And it's during that time that you get this intense peer bonding. So for teenagers, they want to be with their friends. They're dying to be with their friends. Their friends become the most important thing to them. And if you think of it from a survival standpoint, we needed young people to bond with each other, to work together, for males typically to go out and fight, to hunt, to take on incredible challenges like taking on a woolly mammoth or fighting in battle. And we needed females to bond together and work together and take care of each other and their babies while the men were gone. All those brain functions served really important purposes. I had an eighth grade girl the other day. We were doing a little Zoom check-in group. And I said, well, how you doing? Are you staying in touch? And they said, yeah, we're doing the Facebook and we're doing Instagram and Snapchat. And one of the girls said, it's fine, except I'm a really huggy person. And I just want to hug my friends and I don't get to hug anybody. And I know the student, and I know she really is a huggy kid. She loves to be with her friends and all that touching. And you see males, we tend to touch in a different way. We like teen guys like to roughhouse and punch each other and do knuckle punches and all those different things as a way of bonding with each other. And they are driven to bond. Now, those three areas, when you take them together, create what I like to call normal teen angst. So you've probably heard the term angst. It was developed by a philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard. And angst is when you have all these swirling emotions inside of you, and you're just itching to do something with it. You just have all these thoughts and emotions, and you want to direct them for something. You want to do something exciting or have control or be on adventures and be with your friends. Now, unfortunately, sometimes teen angst gets driven in the wrong direction. So if you think about a group of guys in their dad's car, and they're driving down the highway, and one of the friends says, punch it. And the driver steps on the gas. And the thrill of going 80, 90 miles an hour down Highway 470 here in Denver, they're all screaming with great joy until the flashing lights go on behind them or until they have an accident. And you have all the time stories of teens who weren't buckled up and doing dangerous things, just feeling thrill and joy until a disaster happens and they lose control once again. Now, what you're trying to do with that is to help teens direct that into something positive. I like the Michelle, who was on several weeks ago, Michelle Denoy. She likes to use a site called sourcesofstrength.org, sourcesofstrength.org. And it lists 8 different sources of strength for teenagers. The 3 that really stick out to me when I look at that is friends, mentors, and positive activities. So positive adventures. Well, right now, our teens are stuck at home with little contact with their friends. And that's a tough one for them. Other than doing it virtually, they're having little contact. Now, I'm happy to say I was really worried about the teens I see and work with and their ability to just shutter at home and support their family by not going out. And by and large, 90% of them have done just that. And I've been really proud. There are a few that have shared how they've snuck out on a bike ride and they hooked up with a few friends, but they maintained social distancing and they had their masks on and they didn't share any of their smoking products with each other. So they are trying to exercise good self-control. And that's been a real positive. With being back in school, hopefully some of your teens have hooked up with a favorite teacher or perhaps a synagogue or a church youth group director. My daughter's involved with her youth group, and it has meant a great deal to her to be in contact over Zoom sessions they have for the youth group. So you want your kid to still be in touch with the mentors that are important to them. Finally, that activities piece, and this is where it gets tough, is the adventures, the things to do to have fun. And typically, those adventures are bold and challenging. If you think about World War II, my father and his fraternity brothers signed up for the Air Force right at the start of the school year, and 35 of them went down and signed up at the start of the war. Sadly, only 33, only two of them made it home. After 9/11, there was a big surge in young men and women signing up for our armed forces, my stepson being one of them. They want to do something. They want to take on those adventures. They want to be doctors or nurses or paramedics. My son's good friend is a firefighter who loves that action and is stepping up to serve our city and our country. Those are the kind of activities teens thrive on. And now it's important to try to help them find a way, in addition to staying home and sheltering, but what can they do to really get themselves jacked up, get their dopamine levels up, and do something positive. One of my favorite examples was a teenager I saw 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, and he caught up in his homework. He had some failing grades. He got those caught up. He's passing, and then was looking to do something with his time. His father had recently purchased a 3D printer, and he was looking online at the needs for masks, and realized that a 3D printer could make a little part for the back of your face mask, and he made an adjustable clip so that the elastic, instead of going behind your ears, attaches to that plastic piece, and you can adjust it to the proper size, and you don't have that strap around your ears all the time bothering you. And he's been printing those out pretty much night and day, and then they mail them out to healthcare workers or companies that are producing masks, or they put them in bags and stick them on their door, and healthcare people come by and pick them up. And I thought that was just an amazing example of a young teen who's normally is zipping around in his sports car, which is his passion, but now is doing 3D printing to help for masks. I've seen a lot of great art from students at home who are producing creative artworks and showing those to me, and quite a few students who have taken up guitar. And that seems to be a good use of time. From what I understand, it's a fairly hard challenge to play the guitar. So those are a few things, but I would encourage you, and especially as we go into this next phase when things are going to loosen up a little bit, to continue to help your teen explore some activities or passions they can do to produce something and feel good about what they're doing. Allison mentioned it could be cooking meals for the family. I saw an 8th grade girl last week who had made meringue cookies and was squeezing out little flower-shaped cookies. They looked delicious. But that's sort of what you're trying to help them do. So instead of their angst getting channeled into destructive behaviors, whether that's drugs, alcohol, racing the car, all these different things, is into something positive. And my favorite, all-time favorite quotes, something I teach our 7th graders, is by Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is an interesting fellow. He was what's called a nihilist. I like to refer to him as one of the first emo kids. But Nietzsche said, even Nietzsche had some faith in things. And he said, out of chaos comes a shooting star. And my hope for all of you and your teenagers is you can help them direct their chaos that they're feeling into a shooting star and making something productive out of this time at home. Now, as we move forward here in Colorado, they're starting to loosen some of the restrictions next week. I was able to get an appointment with my hairstylist on May 3rd. I told her that my hair's starting to look like Einstein's, and it's starting to scare the children. So we're all going to have a little bit more freedom. Now, here in Colorado, the governor wants us to, we don't have to stay at home. There's another phrase, be safe at home. So they're going to loosen things up. Some businesses will go back to work. And I like to think of this next phase as out of hiding. And on Tuesday, I'll explain that to you. And we'll talk about coming out of hiding that we've all been doing and how to help your children, your preschoolers, and your teens through this next phase, which is going to have this process of opening things up, maybe closing things down, opening up and closing down, that could go on for some time. So I hope you'll join me on Tuesday. We'll discuss that. I'm also hoping next Thursday to have Associates Caleb on to talk about assistive technology for students with learning issues. In closing today, I wanted to share a line from a theologian I saw in Time magazine, and he was talking about lamenting, the Old Testament philosophy of lamenting, or we would say grief work nowadays. We talk about the grief process, but they talk about lamenting or suffering. This week was an important one for me. It was the anniversary of Columbine, the shooting at Columbine, which I was involved with as a mental health first responder. And I happened to be taking my daughter to a doctor's appointment in Littleton, and drove past the Clement Park, which is right next to Columbine High School, and was the epicenter, all of it, and just had some really visceral memories of that, and feelings of lamenting. And especially it was an afternoon when it was cold and raining, just like it was the days after 420 at Columbine High School. So I want to read this to you. And it's about the biblical tradition of lamenting. And so often we ask ourselves, why is this happening? And it's just about, we have to lament sometimes, and we might not have the answers. But the author wrote, and I'm trying to find his name, it's Wright is his last name. He's a professor of New Testament, University of St. Andrews, and he wrote, lament is what happens when people ask why, and they don't get an answer. It's where we get to when we move beyond our self-centered worry about our failings and look at the suffering of the world. In the Bible, God also laments. The Spirit groans, Jesus weeps, God grieves for his world. It is no part of the Christian vocation to be able to explain what's happening and why. In fact, it is part of the Christian vocation not to be able to explain and to lament instead. And I believe that'd be part of the Jewish tradition as well. As the Spirit laments within us, so we become small shrines where the presence and healing love of God can dwell. And out of that can emerge new acts of kindness, new scientific understanding, and new hope. Just a beautiful, beautiful piece. So that I want to say blessings to all of you. Thanks for tuning in. I'll just do a quick check to see if any questions came through. Sydney shaking her head no at me. Thank you, Sydney. As always, there online with me, even while tending to 3 kids, including a preschooler. But I want to wish blessings to all of you in safety, and I look forward to talking on Tuesday as we see this next phase out of hiding starting up. Thank you again for joining me.